Alright, welcome back. So in this video, I want to now set up basically an epistemological framework for studying supernatural or metaphysical events. So I just titled it Metaphysical Science. Now, for me, I feel like this is missing from modern science or the way people think about the supernatural. For me, I feel like I've always been pretty decent at science. And I claim to have a theory on how supernatural things work, which we talked about in through the whole course, right? So book 1 and book 2 on my website. So for me, it's very easy for me to sort of parse the difference between supernatural events and natural events, right? I could very easily come up with a theory for natural events and supernatural events, right? They're very, I can very easily sort of work with both, right? But I think a lot of people have trouble with that, and it's because they're thinking more in terms of the physical sciences a lot of times, or they're thinking more of the supernatural sciences. And so I kind of felt the need to create just really to make a video. We're not really going to talk about too many new things in the video, but I just felt the need to make a video, to establish kind of an epistemological framework for metaphysical science. Right, so just to establish a nice way of thinking or approaching metaphysical phenomena so that we can study them in the context of science. Right, so that's really what I want to do in this video. We're going to borrow a lot of the ideas that I talked about in chapter 2. So in chapter 2, I talked about why atheism makes no sense. So I talked about a lot of the fallacies of atheist logic. So we're going to appeal to that in this video. Right, so I want to start with this first. So going over this, it just says, why do materialists deny the supernatural? Right, so I just want to start with the physical and kind of show the logic of why supernatural things exist and how we approach them. Right, so which again I kind of really already did in chapter 2 of book 2, but we'll kind of do it again here. So materialists generally will say there is no such thing as the supernatural, right? All there is the physical, and there's no reason to appeal to the concept of a supernatural for the observable realm. Now, of course, that's not true. So we talked about in chapter 2 a supernatural fallacy. We talked about how there are many supernatural things, right? So the beginning of the universe was supernatural. Consciousness is supernatural. Near-death experiences, dreams, the ability to move, emotions, all of these things are supernatural events, right? But they don't see them as a supernatural event, even though they clearly are, right? So they'll say there's no evidence of supernatural things, and yet when you give them evidence of clearly supernatural things, they say, oh, no, that's a material thing, right? So I get to claim that. You don't get to claim that as a supernatural event, right? And it's like, okay, because generally what an atheist would say is, I can explain this without referencing any type of supernatural concepts. They say that to me a lot online, and I'm like, okay, when they say that, I'm like, okay, then explain to me where the universe came from. Right? Explain to me how emotions work. Right? Explain how creativity works. And of course they can't, right? And then they'll say, oh, well, we don't really know everything. Yeah, exactly, right? So you do kind of need, I'll say, you can't explain everything solely from a materialist model of reality. So then they'll say, oh, well, that's God of gaps, right? You're just saying it's supernatural because we can't explain. No, that's not true, right? The supernatural model allows us to not only explain what we're observing, we can make predictions that line up with people's reported experiences and what we observe. So it's a completely superior model. They always think we're being as lazy as they are when we believe in these things. They don't believe in it. They don't predict anything. We talked about this really in chapter 2, but when it's something they can't explain, they don't even try to predict it. It's just a million excuses about what it is, and then they just kind of ignore it and stick to the things they can't explain. So they'll say there's no such thing as the supernatural. When you give them evidence of something supernatural, they just ignore it. And then, look, now everything can be explained using a materialist model because I ignored the things I couldn't. Well, like it's like a form of magic that they use, right? Actually, I'm going to talk about magic fallacy in a moment. But I'm just saying. So I kind of, like I said, I already went through this in chapter 2. But my point is that's kind of how they approach things. But I want to now kind of pick a particular supernatural phenomena to set up what I want to talk about. So in science, there's something, or I guess, philosophy, psychology, there's something called the hard problem of consciousness, right? So to go over to this, so if you ask an atheist, well, where does consciousness come from? How does it work, right? And I'll just read this off. So it says the hard problem of consciousness is explained by emergence. So basically, that's their theory on where consciousness comes from, which is not a scientific theory. That's a faith-based argument. But if you were to ask them, well, tell it to me more succinctly, right? Break it down. Where does consciousness come from? So they'll say it comes from the brain, right? It seems to come from when there are changes in the brain, or the brain gets injured, a person's cognitive abilities changes. When there's brain death, the person no longer appears to be conscious. So based on that evidence or those events, it seems that consciousness arises in the brain. Like, okay, right, then explain to me how the brain creates consciousness. So they'll say it's the interaction of neurons. They'll generally start there. Glial cells help those interactions to kind of go more smoothly. And they say when there's a large enough network of those interactions, right, then it creates awareness. And I'm like, okay, then explain how a large network of those interactions creates awareness and free will and emotions and all that. And they'll generally say, we don't know, it just does, right? That's basically what their answer is going to be, right? And so, in other words, what they'll do is they'll explain things up to a point, and then past that point, they'll just say materialism, right? They just give it that sort of, I don't know what the word is. They upgrade it to a materialist explanation somehow, right? So in other words, I can explain consciousness, they'll explain consciousness by neurons and the interaction of neurons, and then awareness, right? Magically, just through magic, that somehow creates awareness. And so what they're actually doing is I'll get to that in a moment. But before I get to that, I just want to say, first, that every explanation in reality, every explanation about anything, every theory, every scientific explanation about anything in the universe, no matter how simple, it always has two components. It has the unexplainable component, which is the magic component, and it has the explainable component, right? So we know, for example, that matter is generally stable because of charged particles, right? And I know there's strong force and things like that. I'm not talking about that for the moment, right? So if you look at chemistry, for example, chemistry works through elements and the behaviors they have as a result of various aspects of the electron clouds, right? The location of electron clouds, orbitals, electronegativities, and things like that, right? And so those things cause chemistry, or allow chemistry to happen, right? So that's the explainable component. Now the unexplainable component would be, well, okay, what causes electrons to have charge, for example, right? Because that's really the main thing that creates chemistry. Where do electrons get charged from? No one knows, right? So that's the magic component. So in other words, you can't actually explain everything through a materialist model. There's always some components you can't explain, which is the magic component. It's just a question of how specific you want to get in terms of the explanation. So if you accept that you can't explain the component where charge comes from, then you can say, okay, everything after that I can explain, and I guess is materialistic, right? Now I say, right, which I talked about in the other videos, that even that's a fallacy, right? Because you're just ignoring, you say you can explain everything by just ignoring the part you can't explain, right? The part you can't, everything you're explaining still depends on the part you can't explain. Now for me, all explanations are going to go down to a first cause event, right? First cause events are, which we're actually going to talk a little bit about this in the next video that I make, but first cause events are the result of God's Spirit. So that's said in the Bible. So Hebrews 1:3, if I remember correctly, Hebrews 1:3 says, it's actually one of my favorite verses, I should be able to remember it. It says that the Son shares in the glory of God and is the exact imprint of his nature. He sustains all things by the power of his word. I know it's stated a little differently, his powerful word. I like to say by the power of his word. And after purifying the world of sins, he's seated at the right hand of the Father. So in other words, that kind of tells us the first cause for all the universe is God. It's Jesus Christ, right? He sustains the universe by his power, Colossians, I believe it's Colossians 1:17. He's before all things, and in him all things hold together. So even a first cause is explained by the supernatural model, right? So the materialist model doesn't explain them, just ignores them, and then says, voila, I explained everything, right? I ignored everything I can't explain, I ignored, and then voila, I can explain everything. That's basically their logic, right? And so what atheists do is they will generally look at the reality around them, and they will say, well, I feel like I can explain most things without appealing to the supernatural. And so when they get to those few things they really can't explain, they'll just say it's material just because everything else appears to be material to them. And that's a fallacy, right? In fact, to go over this next point, it says, atheist magic fallacy is a logical error of assuming that any phenomena that shows first cause behavior is purely material because everything else appears to be. So let me actually break that down. So actually, before I get into it, I want to talk about that first cause part. So if we think about things that are generally appear supernatural, right? So consciousness, which has free will, and awareness, emotions. When we think about creativity, when you're in the zone and creative ideas are just come into your mind. Dreams, right? So dreams there are things that show up in dreams that can't possibly be explained in terms of just physical interactions, stupid interactions in the brain, right? So the brain just doing things according to the laws of physics, right? There are things that show up in our dreams that are not part of our normal pattern of thoughts. They're not part of our memories. There's nothing in our memory to kind of cause what's shown up in our dream to be there. There's no reason our brain, if it's just physical interactions of neurons, should be creating these things in our dreams. So there are many aspects of our dreams all the time that cannot be explained in terms of just the brain. Near-death experiences, things that show up in near-death experiences, right? These are supernatural phenomena. So if we think about things we generally consider to be supernatural, demonic experiences, experiences with angels, experiences with God, what they all seem to demonstrate is first cause behavior. And what I mean by that is that these events, they can't be explained in terms of prior causes, right? So like the beginning of the universe is a first cause event. You can't explain it in terms of anything else. Me, for example, I'm conscious, right? I'm a supernatural event because I have consciousness, I have free will. You can't explain everything I'm going to do based on prior causes, right? So all of reality, the physical reality, or most of it I should say, you can explain everything that's going to happen in terms of previous causes. So if I flip this marker, right, if you know the initial set of conditions, then you can easily explain everything that's going to happen after that. Right? And it's going to do it every single time for all of eternity as long as it shares those initial conditions. But that's not true for me, right? If you interact with me in some way, right, if you say something to me, I may respond this way one day, I may respond this way another day. There's no real way to know like what I'm going to do, right? You can't put it solely in terms of variables, right? Now, quantum mechanics, you could predict certain things according to probability, and you could predict certain things with probability with people, but not according to not in the same way you could do it quantum mechanics. It's not going to perfectly follow the rules of eigenvalues and things like that, right? If you do the same thing to me for long enough time, I'll just do something completely different that you couldn't really predict based on the prior causes. And so first cause phenomena, what we recognize from this is that supernatural phenomena seems to have first cause behaviors, right? And so that's, for example, dreams as well. Dreams have there's some component of a dream that doesn't make any sense in terms of prior causes. It would seem to be a first cause phenomenon, which we talked about dreams in chapter 10 of book 2. We talked about what influences dreams and things like that. Angels, your experience with angels, your experience with God, or even demons, right? You can't just always say, well, if I always do this, then this is always going to be this way. No, right? It's a first cause event. You can't do that with me, and you can't do that with these supernatural phenomena either. So all of these things are first cause events. So we can say that what appears to be the case is that supernatural phenomena are phenomena in reality that demonstrate first cause behavior, right? Just like the beginning of the universe, that's a supernatural event because that was a first cause behavior. Now, what atheists do, and what I mean by atheist magic fallacy, is they will look at all the universe and all the phenomena around them, and now they can explain almost everything, it's true, in terms of with using a materialist model. But there are a few things, which I mentioned, that they can't explain. And it's not just that they can't explain it, right? In the same way, there was a time when people couldn't explain fire. That's usually what they'll say. Oh, well, we thought fire was a supernatural event, and guess what? We were able to explain it. No, that's not what's happening here. Again, I already talked about that in supernatural fallacy, right? The error of that thinking. But here it's different because fire, I know if I rub some sticks together, I'm always going to get fire, right? I may not know why. During times I'm not successful, let's say it's humid outside, I may not necessarily know why, but I have a general idea that if I do this, especially under certain conditions, I'll always get this, right? I just don't know why that's the case, right? Or even if I get sick, right? If I don't know what sickness is or what causes it, I can still set up experiments to get an idea where if I always do this, I'm always going to get sick, right? If I leave some food out for like a month and then I eat it, I'm pretty much always going to get sick and there's nothing I can do about it. That's not what's happening here. So dreams, there's nothing you can do to always have the same dream, right? There's nothing you can do to a person to make them always choose the same thing, right? There's no way you can interact with God to always have the same event or always have an NDE this way. No, right? There's nothing you can do to always make your emotions, or at least someone else can interact with you, to always make your emotions do the same thing. No, all of these events are first cause events, right? Meaning that you can't get the same outcome with the same initial prior causes, right? It's always going to do something just on its own that's not related to a prior cause, right? And so it demonstrates first cause behavior. And so atheists can look at almost all of reality that doesn't do that, right? All of Earth, across the universe, the stars, everything, right? When you look at the interaction of elements in chemistry or compounds, things like that, the laws of physics, all of it just does stuff in a very dumb way, right? If I have the same initial set of conditions, it's always going to do this till the end of time, never does anything differently. But there's a few phenomena that's not true. And those are the ones that demonstrate first cause behavior. So it would seem reasonable to believe that these few phenomena are doing things that none of the rest of the universe does. There's something clearly different about them. It would stand to reason there's something supernatural going on there, right? So an atheist would say, no, I know this thing does something completely different from everything else, but I'm still going to say it's like everything else based on the fact that, basically just based on quantity, I guess, right? So most things, that's why I say everything else appears to be, because most things appear to be material. I'll just say these things that appear supernatural also material. Well, that doesn't make any sense. It's perfectly possible for like 99% of the events we see in reality to be natural, and then that 1% be supernatural. There's nothing wrong with that. There are many things in reality which we only see sometimes, or a little bit of the time, and there are things we see lots of times, right? There's no rule that says that this event, in order for this event to exist, it has to occur at this frequency. That makes no sense, right? And so that's a fallacy, right? And so I call it atheist magic fallacy. I don't know if I mentioned it yet, because when atheists, a lot of times what they're doing is when they say there's no supernatural phenomena, they'll take an event, let's say it's dreams or consciousness, they'll explain it up to a point, and then past that point, they would add what I call atheist magic to it. So they just add their magic and just say, because like I said before, all explanations at some point reduce to magic, right? And so when they get to that point where they can't explain something, they add their own magic and just say it's a material event. So I have claimed this event, so I have claimed consciousness as a material event, I've added my magic to it, and now it's officially material. So you have to find some other event, right, that counts under your umbrella of supernaturalism. Until you can do that, then you've never proven anything supernatural, you've never demonstrated anything being supernatural to me, right? And so, of course, that's a fallacy. That makes no sense, right? Just because other things appear supernatural, pure natural or explainable in terms of physics, doesn't mean these few things, which have very different properties from everything else we observe, doesn't mean that they're also natural. Also, you can't just, look at something, get to a certain point in explanation, and then at that point just magically say it's material. That makes no sense. And so, of course, they'll say, oh, well, you're doing God of gaps, which is not true, right? Our explanation for reality is much better. It covers a much wider range. It's a much better explanation for theirs. They don't even try to explain things half the time, right? The metaphysical model of reality covers, it's a much better explanation for the events, and it lines up with the observable data. Much better. It's not perfect, but it's a much better explanation for what we're observing than materialism, which doesn't even try to explain things it can't understand. It's just always an excuse, right? It's always some reason why something didn't happen, or it was a big coincidence, or science will one day figure out. It's always some excuse, right? And so, but if you look at what they're really doing, right? Actually, let me go to this next point. Because I want to get into, because I already talked about all that, like the lack of logic in that in chapter 2, but there's basically somewhere I want to go with this. So to get to this next point, it says, the assertion of lack of evidence of the supernatural is rooted in confirmation bias. So that's actually very important, and that's really what I want to get into, right? Because an atheist, a lot of times they'll say, when someone has experiences with God, they'll say, or they feel like God is speaking to them, or God answered their prayer, they'll say, oh, you're engaging in confirmation bias, right? Which is funny because they do the same thing, right? So I always say, right, anything an atheist accuses someone who believes in God of, they do the exact same thing. So one of the things they do it with is confirmation bias. So they'll say, oh, the religious person is engaging in confirmation bias. So let me go just a little bit into it. A lot of times an atheist will say, oh, I used to be Christian, and, I was looking for God, and, I tried to believe in the Bible, but it didn't make sense, and, I was trying so hard to believe, but I had to accept the fact that it just didn't make sense, and no God was speaking to me, right? Like, okay, what about the people who did make an effort to search for God and find Him, and they did find God, and God did start speaking to them, and they had supernatural experiences with Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit and God the Father and His angels and things like that? What about that? Oh, well, it's just in their mind, and they're basically just affirming what they really want to believe because they don't want it to be true. Okay, but why isn't it the other way around? Why isn't it the case that they actually found God and you're the one engaging in confirmation bias? You failed for some reason. They actually succeeded in finding God. Something was wrong with you and you failed to find Him. So it's actually you who are engaging in confirmation bias. You don't want to admit that you failed or that you're a failure. So you're just making up some excuse to make it so that you're not the one who was the reason for not finding God. Right? So you're engaging in confirmation bias, right? Why is it that when they found God, they're just crazy and you're not? But when you not finding God, and it's not the case that you're just a failure and they're not crazy because they did find God. Hopefully I said that right, but you get what I'm saying. So obviously that's just confirmation bias, right? In another place that you engage in that confirmation bias is in supernaturalism. Because if you really think about what the atheist is saying, right, when they're saying that the lack of, when I say here the lack of evidence of the supernatural is rooted in confirmation bias, what they're really assuming is that, and we talked about this in chapter 2, they're assuming that a subjective experience, so let's say God spoke to me, right, which He has spoken to me lots of times, right, let's say He spoke to me. They would say, let's say I had an experience. So I had an experience when I was sealed by His Holy Spirit. It was an amazing experience, right? I loved it, right? But I had experience being sealed or receiving the Holy Spirit's mark, right? Now they would, if I told that to an atheist, they would say, "Oh, you're crazy," and this and that, right? And so, what makes it invalid has a true phenomena that existed in reality. Well, what makes it invalid is the first thing they would ask is, "Oh, what is your evidence the Holy Spirit actually gave you His mark or sealed you? What is your evidence the Holy Spirit exists?" Well, I experienced them. That's my evidence. Lots of people have experienced them. Not just me. We talked about this in empirical evidence fallacy. We talked about the requirements, which we kind of went over what I'm going to go through in scientific method then too. But again, I'm just going to formalize in this video. So I've experienced the Holy Spirit. I've experienced ways He's changed my life. There's things He told me about that did happen. Many people have the same experience when they engage in certain behaviors, right? And they'll just say, "Oh, well, it's in their head, and for all we know, it could just be in their head. There are lots of people. There are people who've killed people, and they feel like God told them to do it, and then they'll come up with any excuse, right? And so they'll say, in order for it to really count as evidence, or you could just be having these experiences because you really want them, or there's some delusion, maybe you ate something strange that day, always an endless list of excuses. And so they'll say, what they're really getting at is, in order to really, for this event to really exist, or be demonstrable or demonstratable in reality, it has to be something they can observe. Right? That's really what they're saying. I have to be able to provide evidence in a way that they're able to verify. Perhaps through showing them something, right? Maybe the Holy Spirit gives me power and I do something extraordinary, right? And then if I can do that, they might be willing to believe. Or maybe they want to see the Holy Spirit with their physical eyes or something, right? There's something they're looking for that I can demonstrate to them, right? In order to prove that the Holy Spirit exists, right? And that this experience is real and that I interacted with the Holy Spirit. And so what you really get these senses that they're really saying is that in order for some truth about reality to be valid, it must be externally demonstratable in some way, right? And that gets to this next point. So it says materialists, which is just atheists, but materialists require the unexplained component to be physically measurable or externally observable, right? And so in other words, they say, a materialist would say, that something, so I said before that any theory about anything always reduces to magic, right? To something you can't explain, right? So if we're trying to explain electromagnetism, we know electromagnetism comes from charged particles. Generally, they lose energy and emit photons, right? But to explain that, we have to know why particles have charge, like electrons, and no one knows why they have charge, they just do. So that's the magic part, right? Basically, magic is why electrons have charge, right? But what atheists are doing is they will accept that and still claim the electron. They don't know why it has charge, but it's still a material event. It still counts to them as a material event because they can physically observe it or measure it, right? We can measure charged particles. And so, that doesn't make any sense. It could still be Jesus Christ's Spirit, Jesus Christ's Spirit sustains all the universe. So the first cause of all the laws of the universe is still God's Spirit. And so the electron can have charge because of God's Spirit. God's Spirit gives it charge. Then everything after that is just things that occur as a property of what God's Spirit gave to the electron. But still, I'm sure that there's more levels which I can say that about God's Spirit, but still, they would just say, nope, I can measure it, therefore it's material. But you kind of see that there is an issue with that explanation, because it's assuming that, okay, let's say the unexplained component is not physically measurable, right? Let's say the Holy Spirit appears to me, or gives me his mark, and I experience a supernatural event. So I can only measure it through my own subjective experience, right? I can't use instruments to measure it. And because it's my own subjective experience, I can't demonstrate it to you. It can still be an event in reality. It could have still happened. There's no rule saying that an event in reality must necessarily be measurable by physical instruments and not measurable by my own experience, right? There's no rule saying that. Why? Why can't something, if I experienced it, why is it impossible for it to exist? Some things can just exist and only interact with me in terms of my conscious mind, so I can only experience them in my internal mind, but can't demonstrate them to you. And that, of course, is what we talked about in Chapter 2, which is subjectivity fallacy. And so what the atheist is really saying with this rule here is he's really saying, actually, no, let me read over this next point. It says the materialist requirement asserts that the unexplained component is not allowed to be subjectively verifiable. So we talked about that before. So in Chapter 2 of Book 2. So a subjectively verifiable event is just some event that you can verify from your own subjective experience. Another way I like to say is that is internally observable. So when the Holy Spirit interacts with me, I can observe it internally within my own mind and my own feelings, right? He's still interacting with me. He still exists. I verified his existence from my own internal experience and my internal measurements. But the atheist says, no, something can't exist unless it's physically measurable. You must be able to demonstrate it, and it must be measurable with instruments, or nothing in reality is allowed to exist. Why? Who gave you the power to make that rule, right? And of course, they'll come up with a million excuses, right? But that's basically their logic, right? Or there's just never any evidence of it, right? Even if they would say, okay, well, if it exists, there's no way for me to know, so I can't go with that. I can't get jiggy with that, basically, right? But now so this goes back to the stars and stripes fallacy, which I talked about in chapter 2. So now what's actually happening is they're placing a condition on how reality is allowed to behave in terms of it presenting evidence to us. Now, like I said, also in chapter 2, empirical evidence fallacy, evidence is not this thing that there's absolute proof of, right? There's no evidence that I'm here, on camera. There's no absolute evidence that, I'm even in a room. For all I know, I could be dreaming. Who knows, right? Absolute evidence doesn't exist, right? Evidence is just an opinion, right? Any two people can look at a body of evidence, just like the earth being flat, right? Or the earth being round. I'll say that first. The earth, if you look at all of the evidence of around earth in the solar system, which I guess you can use that too to prove the earth is round. Two people can look at all the evidence, and one person can say, well, this shows the earth is round. Another person can say this shows the earth is flat, even though they're looking at the same evidence. Now, obviously, there's a fallacy in their logic, right? But it's still just their opinion on what's evidence and what isn't. So an atheist would say in their opinion, nothing counts as evidence of something existing unless it is physically measurable. Now, of course, that makes no sense, right? Or they'll say, unless everyone has the same experience, well, if something is subjectively... Actually, no, I'll go into that in a moment. But that's another thing they'll say. Oh, well, if Christian God was real, then everyone would have experience with him. There wouldn't be people who have experiences with Buddha or Krishna or Muhammad or whatever, right? Which that's not true. We talked about spiritual relativity principle, right? And we talked about some other principles, but that's another one of the rules they just magically place on reality, and they place on God and say God can't exist unless he does this thing I made up in my head, right? So that's basically how they approach reality. But now what I want to do is I want to now acknowledge that no, obviously that makes no sense, and it is possible for supernatural phenomena to exist in such a way where it interacts with me, right? So it interacts with my consciousness, and I'm able to internally observe it, but it's not externally observable or demonstratable. And so now why would something interact with my consciousness and not physical matter, right? My brain, after all, comes from consciousness, my consciousness comes from my brain, after all, according to materialists. Well, the reason that might occur is if my consciousness isn't a material, right? So if it's not material, which it isn't, of course, then it may be of a substance that is able to interact with another spiritual substance, right? But it doesn't interact with physical matter because physical matter is not a spiritual substance. Perfect explanation. So then you might say, well, how is the spiritual substance of my consciousness interacting with physical matter if spiritual substances don't really interact with matter that much? I'll explain that in a moment, right? Actually, when I get to here, because that's basically an exception. But if my consciousness is something different that isn't physical matter, if it's spiritual in nature, then that would basically explain why other spiritual things are able to interact with the nature of my consciousness, which is also spiritual, and spiritual things don't interact with matter because they're not spiritual, right? And so that gets into here. So how do we study... Actually, no, before I get into that, let me get to this point here. So it says supernatural phenomena. We can basically conclude that supernatural phenomena strongly interacts with the consciousness, but weakly interacts with matter. So basically what I'm getting at there, and this is really what I want to kind of get to for this video, when I'm setting up the framework of metaphysical science, is we have to understand that supernatural phenomena, we know it exists. We can still measure it and study it and recognize its existence by our own internal experience. Just because atheists say nothing can exist unless it's externally observable or demonstratable, of course that doesn't make it true. I can also place any random rule I want to make up on reality, and then whose wins out? You know what I mean? Because obviously nothing we say makes any difference on how reality actually works. Right now, I recognize that. Of course, they don't. Right? And so it is perfectly possible for something to exist, but be measurable and observable within my own internal experience. And another way of saying that is that the the phenomena strongly interacts with my consciousness or my spirit or my soul, right? So when I say strongly interacts, I just mean it happens very often and in a very noticeable way. So when God interacts with us, doesn't always happen in a super noticeable way, but he can interact with us in a very noticeable way, right? Through his presence, by giving us the presence of the Holy Spirit, by feeling it. We recognize it feels completely different from our normal feelings, right? He can heal us in different ways and things like that. So that would be a strong interaction. Now, so again, just something that happens very often and something that is generally very noticeable. Now, let me just back up. Supernatural events strongly interact with consciousness. So they're internally, so in your own awareness, in your feelings, they're very noticeable and they happen often. Now, when I say they weakly interact with physical matter, I mean it's a rare event and it's hard to detect. So, for example, neutrinos are very difficult to measure, very difficult to detect, because they only really interact with the weak force. It's called weak because it's a rare interaction. I mean, it's a rare event when the weak force occurs. So it's very hard and very rare to measure neutrinos. And so it's the same thing with spiritual phenomena, right? So supernatural phenomena can interact with matter. It's just a rare event. And not only is it rare, it's even more limited because it demonstrates first cause behavior. So what's an example of that? So God healing people. So when God heals people, look up Robert Marshall's experience, right? So he basically, according to his testimony, right? He says he has medical records for it. He was basically dead, or he should have had massive brain damage, and he was basically healed. Now, of course, an atheist will just say, "Oh, it was just a magical coincidence," right? It was a magical coincidence that happened while he claims to be experiencing God. It was a magical coincidence that happened, right, in a way that should have been impossible and violates the laws of physics as we know it, right? Science will one day figure out, of course, there's no God, and now that I have ignored that, there's obviously no evidence of supernatural, right? So that's how they would approach that, which is how they approach everything, supernatural. But no, of course, that there's something that went on there, which I believe him, that was God, right? But there's nothing you can do to always do A, B, C, and D, and then God's always going to do this, right? No. God is supernatural there, which means he engages in first cause behaviors. Sometimes he'll do this, sometimes he'll do that, right? There's no way to know. There's nothing you can do to always get this outcome. So God healing him through a miracle is something that would show up in physical matter. So he would experience it through his own internal observation, which he had an NDE with Jesus Christ, but also that's shown up in physical matter. So it doesn't always show up in physical matter, but in this case it did. So when I say a weak interaction, it just means it's a rare event. And it's even more rare because you can't always guarantee when it's going to happen, because it engages in first cause behavior. Even when I charge spiritual energy, so we talked about that in chapter 3 of book 2, when I focus on Jesus Christ and I transcendentally connect to him, I'll gain spiritual energy. In theory, you can measure that in my body in some way. There should be some way to measure that. You'll see that the response from my body is unique, right? It doesn't matter how happy I am or how in love I am or whatever positive emotion you want to pick. My body will not do the same thing it does when I focus on Jesus Christ. If I focus on some other deity or some other anything, right? And I think this is true even for people in other religions. You know, you can talk to a Hindu and have them focus on Krishna, and you can talk to a Muslim and have them focus on Muhammad or whoever. And I believe, I don't know if instruments are sensitive enough to do this, but I believe that in some way, shape, or form, there's going to be something unique about the physical body that happens when you focus on Jesus, right? So, but that would still be a weak interaction. That would be an interaction with matter, but it would be a weak interaction because the measurements themselves don't really give you information about the event or the phenomena of Jesus Christ, right? Just like, emotions, the experience of emotions is a supernatural event. My body can do a whole bunch of different things, but the things my body's doing doesn't prove the emotion. The strong interaction is with me, right? My experience, that proves the emotion. I'm feeling it, right? So that's how I know emotions exist. So supernatural phenomena strongly interacts with the consciousness, weakly interacts with matter, and weakly in this case just means it's either a rare event or it's an event that doesn't strongly prove the phenomena itself. Now, natural phenomena is the opposite, or the phenomena that physics studies. It weakly interacts with the consciousness, strongly interacts with matter, right? So any event I study in physics strongly interacts with the four forces, or strongly interacts with matter. I can easily measure it in an instrument, but it weakly interacts with consciousness. So if you hit me, for example, I'll feel pain. Now you can measure all types of stuff with the interaction of the thing that hit me, right, and to verify it happens. But you won't really be able to verify the pain I'm feeling, right? I can verify it in my experience of it, which is my consciousness, sort of verifies the event, but very weakly. There's lots of things I can feel that don't necessarily need to indicate the event happens. So the event weakly interacts with my consciousness, but my experience or feeling of the event doesn't necessarily prove the case, right? So you kind of see this dichotomy or this bifurcation, right? You see that now you kind of see that supernatural phenomena is more strongly consciousness-based and internal experience-based. It weakly interacts with matter. You can study it to some degree through matter, but not very strongly. And you see physics is the reverse, right? You can study externally and using instruments in a very strong way. You can prove things very easily in a very strong way or make a very strong case. You can prove things very easily or make a very strong case based on physical measurements, but you can, in the weaker cases with experience, but you can still do it with experience, right? So we can't study these two types of events, physical events and supernatural events, or natural events and supernatural events, in the same way, because the strong interaction is, one's external and physically measurable, and one's internal and experiential. So we, of course, have to change how we think about studying these two events. So before I go further, I now want to talk about, I now want to kind of even broaden the analysis to fifth dimensional space. And so just to go over this, it says the fifth dimension is the realm of space, time, and thoughts. So what do I mean by that? Well, basically, if you think about Euclidean space, so think about, there's basically just three dimensions, right? If you define if you define distance in three-dimensional space, and I'm just picking a random, observable quantity like distance, right? You can easily define distance, which is just x squared plus y squared plus z squared. Well, the square root of the sum of those is distance, right? I don't have to make any reference to time. I don't have to make any reference to thoughts. I can easily measure distance without any, just using the coordinates, the x, y, and z components, the x, y, z coordinate. Right? Now, with respect to the origin, in this case. Now, Einstein's shown, so that's three-dimensional space, right? Einstein's shown that there are certain phenomena where you can't do that. You can't ignore the time component, right? So if I'm measuring the distance between two events, I can't just say that, I can't just take the x, y, and z components, the difference between two events, and then time is completely independent. No. Right? Now time matters. So I can't, and this has to do with relativity and space, time-like intervals, things like that. So if I'm taking the distance, I need to specify the time. And so, again, this is a relativity concept. So if I just take the x, y, and z component, it's completely, I'm looking for, undefined. I have to have time for distance to be defined. Right? And so what Einstein recognized is that there's a fourth dimension, right? I should say time is actually the fourth dimension of space when it comes to measuring distance. Different variables, different observables. I'm just saying distance in this case. So in this case, and the metric is x squared plus y squared plus z squared minus time squared, right? So the square root of that difference. But you can reverse it depending on the convention you want to use. But either way, you have to include time. Time is no longer independent. And so what he said is that the space where you define distance now is not just space or Euclidean space. Now it's space-time, right? And so what I was thinking is I would hear a bunch of near-death experiences talk about how people would be in the void, right? There's this thing that constantly shows up in NDEs called the void. So it's just this black space where people's thoughts seems to create reality. Now, what's kind of disappointing for me is that there's so many NDEs now that I'm starting to get the sense are false, right? And even God has shown me that. He's told me, I don't think I even mentioned it on camera yet. He's shown me how, So I mentioned before how he showed me how fallen angels basically fake near-death experiences. He's given me another experience where I think, oh, I saw this huge dragon. It's actually 2 times I had that dream, which I felt like was a vision. I think that dragon is what is often called Leviathan, right? So, which I heard about him one time from Micah Turnbull, but what I saw, I think it was him, and I think he's also responsible for creating fake NDEs. And I was like, I get disappointed sometimes, because there are times when I'm like, I think an NDE is real, and then I get the sense later it's fake, and I feel like God has confirmed it for me. Like, yeah, that's a fake one, right? But the thing is the good thing about, and that's actually why that's another reason why I want to change the paradigm of how I talk about the soul, right? Because I pasted on Carrie Cohan's experience, which I was just using the word she used, but even now I'm like, you know what I mean? So I'm going to readjust it. I'm going to make the video called Journey of the Soul, and it's going to be based more closely to what the Bible says. And even thinking in those terms, I feel like it's even more accurate. It's a more apt description of reality. So you'll see that video to get a better idea of my new kind of understanding of what the soul is. Again, much of what I still said in chapter 9 when I talked about the soul and higher self, pretty much all the same. I'm going to change around some terms and create a slightly different framework to work from. But yeah, anyway, so in a lot of NDEs, even if they're fake and they're from demons, I believe that what demons a lot of times will do is they will still give you partial truths, right? A half-truth is more believable than a whole lie. So they'll still give you truths, they just mix it in with a lie to deceive you and keep you away from Jesus Christ. And so I'll probably make another video on NDEs too, when my new thoughts on them, on a lot of them. But still, in a lot of those experiences, they talk about the void, and I think the void is real. So basically what happens in the void is, the void is considered to be the space of creation. And so their thoughts basically just continuously create reality in the void. And what it made me think about was the concept of 3-dimensional space and 4-dimensional space. So, and I kind of already mentioned this in chapter 10. So in chapter 10, I said how in the spirit realm, spiritual matter interacts with thought. It responds to thought, right? And so I kind of want to even formalize that idea a little bit more here and say that in the spirit realm, I believe the spirit realm is actually concepts like time and concepts like coordinates or space, right? Coordinates in space and concepts of time, they're now connected with thought. Very important. So in other words, in 3-dimensional space, I could define distance without any reference to time and thought. That's why it's 3 dimensions. In 4-dimensional space, I need time to make a concept to define distance. So they're intertwined with each other. They're not separate. Time is not independent of space. Space isn't independent of time. That's why it's 4 dimensions. Now in 5th-dimensional space, right, and Einstein called 4th-dimensional space space-time because space and time are intertwined. And so now I've come to believe that 5th-dimensional space is space-time thought, because space, time, and thought are now intertwined. You can't define thought or time you can't define space or time without referencing thought. They're all intertwined together, right? And that's what I believe is happening when people have near-death experiences and they see certain things, right? So concepts like time, how much time has passed, the distance between one point and another point, it doesn't really make any sense without referencing thought. And I think when we dream, for example, we're in 5th-dimensional space. So the distance in my dream has no meaning outside of my own thoughts. So I believe I'm in the space of creation in the spirit realm. I created some random thing in my dream, and the passage of time and space are all intertwined with my thoughts. I can't define these things without including my thoughts into them. And so I believe now the spirit realm is actually the 5th dimension, right? Using the same nomenclature, is that the right word? Using the same terminology I think Einstein used when he was talking about fourth dimensional space, or the 4th dimension. Width dimension is just a term that kind of gets thrown around. Technically, it refers to units of length, but you can mean different things with it. But in this case, I'm just kind of using it the same way I think Einstein used it. So, the spirit realm technically is 5th dimensional space. So it's the 5th dimension, right? So the fifth dimension is where our consciousness exists and where our soul exists. And this realm is actually the three dimensions. Now, that doesn't mean that the spirit doesn't interact with this realm sometimes, or things in fifth dimensional space can't sometimes interact with this space. It doesn't mean that time itself is not a part of space in the world we're in. It just means you can get away with ignoring its effects, right? So, for example, you would still need you can use relativity to find distance, right, between any two events, like in this room, for example. But the effect of the relativistic equation, for example, or approach, would be so negligible compared to the non-relativistic equation, or non-relativistic equation for distance, that you would virtually can get away with just ignoring it, right? You can ignore the fourth dimensional component of distance. And it's the same thing with the fifth dimension. The effect of thought that thought has on distance is so negligible, you can just get away with ignoring it. So you can say, because it's so negligible, in this room, I exist in this room in the third dimension. Now, if I were on a spaceship flying near the speed of light, right, there would be certain phenomena that I would experience, or that you would need to reference to observe me, that you can then say I'm in fourth dimensional space, right? Because now you have to start using principles regarding relativity. If I'm near a black hole, right, you got to use principles regarding relativity to analyze what I'm doing. So you would have to say, in that case, I'm in the fourth dimension. So that's just what I mean by saying that. So right now I'm in the third dimension. If I'm in a spaceship traveling near the speed of light, then I'm in the fourth dimension. Now, when I go to the spirit realm, which is like astral projecting or having a near-death experience or even just regular dreaming, right, that's the fifth dimension, right? So that's basically how I want to set things up. And so metaphysics studies the fifth dimension. Now, before I get into that, right, because I'm going to go into that a little bit in a moment, we can now say, okay, so if fifth dimensional phenomena, or metaphysical phenomena or spiritual phenomena, if they're in the fifth dimension, the space of space-time and thought, apparently they don't strongly interact with things in the third dimension, right? So the part of reality where you can just ignore the connection of time and thought to space, right? That's the realm we live in. So how is it the case that since they're a weak interaction, like I said, right, fifth dimensional or spiritual phenomena doesn't interact with matter very strongly, three-dimensional matter very strongly, how is it the case that it's interacting with me, right? So how is it the case that it's interacting with me? For an angel, for example, I even mentioned on camera, I forget which video, I think there was a video on I was talking about psychic abilities. So I mentioned how on camera I was praying to God one day, I asked him a question, and I felt like there were like mad angels that came in the room. I could sense them, like there was like a lot of them, right? And then it was a very short time that I could sense when they left, right? It was an amazing experience. I can kind of see an image in my mind of like these like whitish, bluish figures. I even saw wings. And I remember a time when I was younger, right? When I was still living in sin, and I knew that there was a demonic entity. Well, I didn't call him that at the time, but I felt like there was this negative presence right in front of me. Like literally, right? It wasn't here, it wasn't here, it was right here. I can outline it because I can feel it so strongly that it was just like looking at me. I didn't know which orientation it was facing, but it felt like it was just facing me. And I felt it so clearly. You know what I mean? And so the question is now, assuming these are fifth dimensional or spiritual phenomena, how are they interacting with me in this way if it's a weak interaction, right? It's an interaction that doesn't strongly prove the case. More specifically, they're interacting with my consciousness, but how does my consciousness interact with my physical body is really what I'm trying to get to. Because it's a weak interaction, right? But clearly I'm not interacting with my physical body in a weak way at all. It's a very strong interaction between my spirit or my soul and my physical body. So everything else interacts very weakly with my body, every other fifth dimensional phenomena, but my consciousness, which is also a fifth dimensional or spiritual phenomena, interacts extremely strongly with my own physical matter, my body, but then goes back to normal with everything else. So it also interacts with other things very weakly, just like every other spiritual phenomena interacts with physical matter very weakly. So there seems to be something going on. If my theory is correct, why does my spirit interact with everything else weakly, just like every other spiritual phenomena, but it interacts with my physical body very strongly, and no other physical phenomena can do that. So my spirit is unique to my body. Well, the reason for that, I believe, comes from this guy. And so it's going over this next point, it says, the exception to weak interactions are living things. All right, and there may be others. But in other words, the spirit or the soul, it normally weakly interacts with every other, excuse me, the spirit or the soul normally interacts with three-dimensional things or physical things very weakly, but it's able to interact with my body, or my spirit and my soul is able to interact with my body, has an exception to the rule. So where does that exception come from? Well, I believe it comes from God, right? So basically I'm alive, right? My being, what it means to be alive is when a soul or spirit, whichever word you want to use, there are different things, but whichever word you want to use for what I'm referring to. So let's just say the soul. When the soul has a strong interaction with physical matter in the form of organic compounds that are all connected, so my physical body, that's what we mean by life. That is a property of life, right? And so when the soul doesn't have that strong interaction, then the physical matter, which is made up of organic compounds, it goes back to only being able to interact with the spirit realm in a weak way, right? So same as every other matter. And so we recognize as something dying, right? It's dead, right? Because it doesn't have a strong interaction with the soul. So God, the reason I say it's an exception is because it's an exception for obvious reasons, right? Other things don't have that rule. But what I mean is that there's no rule you can do, right? It's not like if I always do this and I do this and I do this and I'll always get this strong interaction with the soul in the body. No, right? This exception comes directly from God, from the head honcho, right? From the big guy. And so he's the one that makes it possible for a fifth dimensional thing to have a strong interaction with the three-dimensional thing. There's no rule you can use. There's nothing you can do to replicate it. There's no way to just always do one thing and always get that, right? If God doesn't do it, it's not going to happen, right? That's it. So, in other words, the only way life is possible is through God, right? By his hand. And, when the life is taken away, the reason you can't reanimate the body is because God's spirit is no longer, or God is not allowing for that exception to occur anymore. Again, a first cause phenomena, it's his decision when to allow that and when not to. There's nothing we can do, right? There's no rule you can always follow, right? Because it's a first cause event. And so I believe that this also explains our body. So for one, I don't know enough about biochemistry or biology to sort of say, but I believe and I think I mentioned this in chapter 8 as well, which I made a long time ago from this video. So, especially when I wrote the book. So I believe there's a lot of physical phenomena in our body. Our body shows certain types of intelligence that you just can't explain in terms of chemistry or physical laws, right? And I already know like one or two of them, for example, the placebo effect, right? That's very easily explainable in terms of chi energy, which we talked about in chapter 8. But science has no idea how it works, right? Stress is the same way. They generally attribute it to cortisol. But I believe there's still phenomena you can't explain in terms of just the cortisol release, right? It's because chi energy is manifesting in your frequency. So, which again, we talked about that in chapter 8. So you can very easily explain that using the supernatural model, right? In supernaturalism, we don't just say, it was magically, it happened by magic or super coincidental or, the thing that atheists say, right? We actually have a model that can explain what we're observing. Much of it, we can actually replicate it, right? And do it over and over again. And so I believe this also shows up in just the intelligence of the body. There are many things the body does that you can't just explain in terms of chemistry. But what's really happening is the body is interacting with fifth dimensional space. So it's going to show first cause phenomena, and it's going to show phenomena that other things don't have, right? So it's not just my brain being alive and me, speaking that gives evidence of my being alive, right? Or my being sentient. Right, my body also is going to do things that are intelligent as well, because my cells are interacting with fifth dimensional space. My table is not interacting with fifth dimensional space. My bed isn't, and you know what I mean? The pictures, none of that stuff is interacting with fifth dimensional space. Now, I should say, I'll give a caveat to that in a moment, but none of these things presumably are interacting with fifth dimensional space, so they will engage in behavior that's like, very kind of one-dimensional. But the physical body, when something's alive, then it's going to do things you can't explain because it has a strong interaction with fifth dimensional space. So James Tour, right? So he's a biochemist, right, or chemist, right? So he talks about this a lot. I talked about this in chapter 8 as well, in book 2. He kind of does a little bit of what I'm trying to do. I'm not a scientist. He's actually a scientist. But, I look at a lot of things that are said about emotions and creativity and spiritual phenomena that a lot of atheists or materialists try to say and try to explain complete nonsense to me, right? I feel like I have a theory that explains those things very well. So there are things that I'll see, and I even made the my video on psychic abilities, in chapter 7, when I talked about the misconceptions of psychic abilities, when they'll say, oh, psychic abilities have never been proven, I'm like, that's not true, right? And so because I actually have a theory on how these things work, I can see the conventional statements made about these things. I'm like, no, that isn't true at all. And so James Tour does something similar. He has better credentials than me, of course, but he does it similar with the cell, right? So in Origin of Life research, people will talk about, they're trying to basically figure out how the cell came into existence. So they're basically trying to study abiogenesis, right? What led to abiogenesis and the formation of the cell from inorganic compounds, right? Well, organic compounds, but how the cell was formed from compounds that weren't a part of a living cell, right? So how the first life came to be just from compounds. And so with Origins of Life research, they study that. Now, basically, according to James Tour and what we see, right, it seems like all of the evidence is pointing to the fact, right, that this was basically an impossible event, right? So it seems like someone did it. In other words, it seems like a first cause event, right, just like the beginning of the universe. And so the evidence leads there, but a lot of scientists are materialists, they're atheists, so they're going to make up any excuse under the sun, right, to avoid the explanation of God. And so that's what James Tour talks about a lot, right? In Origins of Life research, they'd say, they've come up with amino acids forming that. I think that was the I forget how they actually say it, right? But if you are familiar with the research, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I think this happened in like the 50s. Milli-Urey experience, something like that, which demonstrate the formation of amino acids from, just from compounds they put in, water. I think it was water, and they did something with electricity or something like that, right? Trying to mimic prebiotic Earth. And they've gone a little bit further with creating organic compounds, but I think they've created a protocell, which is not, a real cell. But according to James Tour, they are nowhere near, right, creating an actual cell as we see it today, right? Now, they would tell you, we're still doing research, and, the other cells were much simpler. And this is what they're doing, right, which is what atheists always do. There's always an excuse. Now, they've never observed this supposedly simple cell that, existed and is where all life came from, right? All that we can observe today are cells. But they would say that, these cells are complex, right? They've evolved from that simple cell. And we've never observed a simple cell. So we don't know really how evolved these cells actually are, right? And so the thing is, they're acting on faith, right? They're acting on faith and just assuming that there was some much simpler cell that would have made everything possible and allowed modern cells to be created. Now, you might say, it's reasonable to make an assumption based on what you observe. Even if you haven't observed something directly, you can observe that something may have came from something else, right? But here's the thing. There's a certain amount of research you can do with that before it's no longer science and it's now faith, right? And so I think I talked about that also in a video on supernatural fallacy. So Isaac Newton, for example. Isaac Newton was a great physicist, great scientist, but he, I think after he created physics and calculus, he helped to create calculus, I believe he just started studying alchemy. Now, at some point, he had enough evidence to conclude that there was no such thing as alchemy as he understood it, right? And he should have just said, okay, my hypothesis was incorrect. The data concludes there's no such thing as alchemy. I'm done. But he didn't do that, right? He just kept going, right? Hoping against hope that there would be some breakthrough. So at some point, it's reasonable to say he crossed over from science into faith. So he's no longer practicing science. And I believe that's the same thing, according to James Tour, what I have seen from his videos. It seems like they're doing that also in Origins of Life research. All the evidence shows that this is basically an impossible event, right? To have a cell. They always say they need evidence. You've never observed this supposedly simple cell that led to everything that you keep claiming, right? They always go into time. Oh, I could go into it further. They talk about time. Time is completely a problem because the moment you have an organic compound, you only have a certain amount of time before it degrades, so it has to actually react in a certain amount of time. They might say, oh, well, minerals helped it to stabilize longer. Yeah, but now that's messing up the reaction. Not to mention, all of these are like lottery winning reactions. There's not even enough. The more lottery winning reactions you have, the more materials you need for the probability, right? And I'll just say this really quickly, right? So if you take like 50 people and have them play like $1 million lottery. Let's say there's a lottery that has the odds of like 1,000,000 to 1, right? If you take 1 million people, maybe one of them might win, right? So now let's say you take 1 million people. Let's say 100 million people, and let's say which I don't know if my math is right, but let's say 100 million people play, and let's say like 90 people win the lottery. Well, now let's say you need those people play the lottery, because now you need another lottery winning reaction, right, in the Origin of Life. Well, those people aren't going to win anything. I believe that's how Origin of Life research is, right? Because they always say, oh, well, it's probability, and there's so many atoms and things like that on a microscopic scale that it's guaranteed to happen. No. But you can't just say, well, if this lottery winning reaction here happens here, and this lottery winning reaction happens here. No. It has to be the same one that had a reaction, now needs to have another reaction, now needs to have another reaction. It can't be, none of them matter because they're starting from scratch. You need a chain of lottery winning reactions. If for that, let's say I wanted like 100 people to win the lottery after some other amount of people win the lottery, right? I would need, let me put it another way. Let's say there's 100 million people, right, who played the lottery and it's 1,000,000 to 1 odds. Well, then 100 people, let's say 100 people win. Now, out of those 100 people, I want 1,000 people to win. Well, there's not even enough people to do that, right? Let alone those 100 people just winning themselves. If I want 100 people to win with 1,000,000 to 1 odds, I would have to multiply 100,000 by another 1,000, right? Which, if my math is right, I don't even know if I'm doing it right. But let's say it's 1 billion, right? Then yeah, if I have 1 billion people play, then 1 million people might, is that right? 1 million? I don't know if I did that right. But suffice it to say, if I have 1 billion people play, then, if I have 1 billion people play, then let's say 1,000 people win. Okay, well now if I have those 1,000 people play, let's even say I get one person that wins, because it's still 1,000,000 to 1 odds. Let's say now I need another 1,000 people. So you see, I need the initial value to be higher and higher and higher to ensure all of these lottery winning reactions by occur, right? And I believe there's not even enough material on the planet to have the necessary lottery winning reactions needed to form a first cell, let alone others. It makes no sense. And so, I'm not a scientist. I haven't gotten that deep into Origin of Life research yet. I am studying biochemistry because I want to start learning that. I mean, I'm studying organic chemistry now because I want to start getting into that. I haven't yet. So I could be wrong, but that's my understanding based on what James Tour says. But my point is that abiogenesis seems to be a first cause event, and the science seems to be showing that. But the thing about materialism, and this is what I talked about earlier, is that they require the unexplained component. So in this case, the unexplained component is the first cell. We don't know how the first cell was formed, and we don't know what it looked like, right? But they require it to be externally observable. It's not allowed to be something you can't observe. Let's say God in a spirit is something you can't observe. Well, they say reality isn't allowed to do that, right? And so it can't, according to them. So it has to be physically observable. So this allows them to always endlessly engage in faith. So I talked about that as the bottlenecking effect in, I think it was in subjectivity fallacy. So in other words, if something is a supernatural event, right, and it's not physical, then you would see the physical explanation always reach a certain point and just never get past it because it's not a physical event. So that is what you see in Origins of Life research. But what they do is they use atheist magic fallacy, and they say, well, because most things appear to be explainable in terms of physical causes, right? They're not first cause phenomena. I'll just say this thing is too, right? So they upgrade it, they add their atheist magic to it, and now it's a material event, right? And of course that makes no sense. So no, I believe that the cells actually intersect with fifth dimensional space. So another thing James Tour says is he says we don't know what life even is. We can define the characteristics of life, like metabolism, responding to the environment, being able to reproduce, like things like that, being able to evolve. But we don't know exactly what makes something alive. For example, why do those things make life? If we take away one of those things, why can't something be alive without one of those things? So no one really knows exactly what life is. We just kind of seem to recognize it when we see it, and when we see it, we say, okay, it always has these things. But we have never been able to create life from scratch. We can only create life from other things that have life. We've never been able to create it from scratch, so we can't really do an experiment to say when something's alive and when it isn't, right? Because I think it would be reasonable to believe you have to take something, make it alive, and then you can easily sort of, now that you have these borders, you can easily see, you can keep running experiments to see when something, the set of things that made something have life, and the set of things that prevent it from having life. But you can't do that because you can't create life. And when something dies, you can't bring it back. And it's the same thing with consciousness, right? So consciousness, they say consciousness is the interaction of neurons, and consciousness comes from the emergence, an emergence phenomenon that results from the interaction of neurons. But you can't necessarily do anything with neurons to say, okay, by doing this, I've created consciousness, and when I take that away, now it doesn't have it, right? So you've never observed the process of becoming conscious, right? You just worked with consciousness from other things that had the ability to create it, but you've never been able to make it yourself from scratch. So you can't really make claims about consciousness outside of, you can't make claims about consciousness that you never observed before, right? And so the materialist explanation doesn't allow you to say how consciousness was created. And the materialist explanation also points to the idea that cells were not, didn't happen by random chance. They appear to be a first cause phenomena. And Origin of Life research largely at this point just seems to be faith-based, right? But I say all of that, I kind of went on a tangent, but I say all of that to say that the thing that creates life is the invisible component. It's the fifth dimension. It's the fact that organic compounds are able to interact with fifth dimensional space. That's why they show properties that nothing else, that other non-living things have. And when something dies, right, it no longer has those properties. It might have them for a little while, but then they go away. Why? Because it's not interacting strongly with fifth dimensional space again. So you can actually explain the cell, you can explain what it does, you can explain the things in the body, right, what the behaviors of cells in the body, because by virtue of the fact that it's having a strong interaction with fifth dimensional space, has an exception to the rule as a result of God's hand, right? So when you get into fifth dimensional space, you have to include components like God, angels, demons, right? When they interact with things, right? They're first cause events too. So you can't just always do this and always get this out. It doesn't work like that in fifth dimensional space. So I just wanted to mention that, but now I want to go here and I want to talk about the general idea of what I want to get to in this video. So just to read this off, it says, the metaphysical scientific method involves instructing an individual to take a series of steps mentally and reporting the outcome. The weak interaction may be measurable, but the strong interaction can only be experienced. conclusions about the phenomena are based on the consistency of reporting patterns, which is pretty much what I already said in chapter 2 when I talked about, I think that was in supernatural fallacy, or that might have been subjectivity fallacy. So I talked about the way we can know something exists supernaturally or spiritually. Right, so it follows the same metrics, same paradigm, at least as I described in chapter 2, as physical phenomena. But this is how, if something can only be verified through subjective experience, then you're just going to have to ask people, right? You're going to have to ask people, well, what did you do? And you're going to have to trust them, right? So there's always a degree of uncertainty with fifth-dimensional phenomena, not like three-dimensional phenomena. I know there's some degree of uncertainty, but then I'm talking about it in a different way. But also, you have to give them instructions and have them, so if they're studying something in the fifth dimension that interacts with their consciousness, then tell them, like, because you can do it on your own for a three-dimensional phenomena. You can set up the experiment, you can run the test, you can ensure you're taking these steps, things like that. You can't do that for someone with a fifth dimensional phenomena. So you have to assure how it behaves, you really do the same thing. You use scientific method, you use a series of steps, you run an experiment, but now you have to rely on someone else to do the experiment. So you have to rely on the person to do this, for example, me. So I told you guys how to charge your subconscious, I told you how the subconscious works, how to charge it, how to control it, how to charge spiritual energy. For me to be verified as being correct, you guys would have to do the instructions or follow the instructions that I gave and then report the outcome. And then I would just have to rely on you guys to say if it is what I said would happen, right? And if it does, if there's a consistency in the reporting patterns of what goes on with the subconscious, then you can assume that yes, my theory of the subconscious is correct. It is a supernatural phenomena, and this is its behavior. Now, there'll be maybe some weak interactions which can be measurable. So if I tell you to charge spiritual energy, your body is going to change in some way. That's going to be pretty consistent for most people when they charge spiritual energy. But that pure measurement of the body doesn't really prove the connection to God, right? Your experience is really what proves that. So that's the weak interaction. The strong interaction, like I said, can only be measured based on person's experience, and so we have to go through, we can make a conclusion based on the consistency in reporting patterns. Again, this is exactly what I said in chapter 2 about semi-empirical data. And so in other words, what I'm getting at here is that for metaphysical events or metaphysical phenomena, we have to use a different type of scientific method, right? The scientific, we still have scientific method, but we have to adjust it now. We have to adjust it to a person's personal experience, and we measure it differently. Same thing with science, physical events. So let's say I'm doing natural science, which is not metaphysical, right? I can take any random series of steps, right, and come out with different outcomes every single time. Now, would you say some theory is false because of that? No, right? You would say, are you following these steps properly according to scientific method, right? Because then your data might be messed up. So then you would take steps to ensure that someone's following the steps properly. And then if the theory is correct, they should always get the same outcome, right? So a similar thing goes on with metaphysics. So if I believe something is going on metaphysically, now you're the only one who can verify it, not me. So if I say, take these particular steps with God, pray to God, ask Him to come into your life, ask Him to receive Jesus Christ and His Holy Spirit. If you take certain steps, you should always get, not always, because God is a first cause phenomena, but you should generally get certain experiences very often if you've done it right. Now, I can't confirm if you've done it right. I can only give you instructions. But generally, if my instructions are correct, if my theory is correct, and we trust the people to follow my instructions, you would generally see a consistency in reporting patterns, right? If my theory about God's nature is correct, even if He is engaging in first cause phenomena, so I can't say, always do this and God will always do this, right? I can still say, generally God will do this when you do this. And so there will be some consistency. Now, of course, there's always going to be deviance as well, right? There's going to be people who didn't actually follow what I said, or they did something wrong or something, right? But they could just be lying as well. But generally, if we trust the participants, you should see a similar reporting pattern, right? Now, we talked about the relativity principle as well. So it's just like fourth dimensional space has relativity, Fifth dimensional space also has relativity, which just means, I talked about this in chapter 10, the spirit realm interacts with thought, or changes according to thought. Some components of my experience or what I create in the spirit realm are going to be true, which reflects the truth of God. Some components aren't. They're just going to be my random imagination. Which components, we don't know, right? So that's how relativity works in the spirit realm. Same thing in the physical realm, or something similar. You just don't include thoughts, right? So Einstein studied relativity in the physical realm. So we have to also we also have to acknowledge the relativity component in the spirit realm, the absolute nature of the realm, right? The absolute nature that we would use to kind of reference all truth would be God, right? There's something similar you do with fourth dimensional space and relativity, which is like proper time, things like that. I don't need to get into that, but I'm just saying. So there's a relativity component and an uncertainty component, but we should generally see a reporting pattern if something's true, right? And like I said, that's exactly what you see with metaphysical phenomena. So when we're studying the subconscious, which I haven't done that yet, right? I put my theory out there, but I'm just saying, I believe people who take my course and do what I say, you'll see that reporting pattern. Like, oh yes, my subconscious did this when I did this. So my theory is correct. When people interact with God in a certain way, especially according to what I said or what the Bible says, they'll have certain experiences. When they engage in sin, they'll interact with demons and they'll have certain experiences. And that's exactly what you see, exactly, right, in the reporting patterns of the population. Right? So we can conclude using this scientific method, God exists, angels exist, demons exist, the subconscious mind is supernatural, there is a such thing as superconscious. We talked about magic, right? Magic is real, and you can go on and on. These are all supernatural phenomena, and this is a proper scientific method for studying these events. So atheists generally, because they're lazy, right, they don't want to do this because this requires you to do work, right? In fact, I'll even go to this next point. It says fifth dimensional engineering, and I'll explain that in a moment. It says fifth dimensional engineering can only be achieved through individual effort. So now what does that mean? Well, when I just use the term engineering because I'm talking about applied metaphysics. So an applied physics or applied sciences for natural science refers to like building things based on the laws of nature, right? So physics studies the laws of nature, engineering applies those laws into building things. So there is a such thing as applied metaphysics, right? So metaphysics, which is what I've been doing this whole time, been teaching you the laws of the spirit realm, and applied metaphysics will teach you how to use those laws to do things. Now in this case, doing things would be like doing things with your soul or your spirit or interacting with supernatural or fifth dimensional phenomena to create certain outcomes. So it's a little bit different, but you know who does things like that in a negative way would be witches, would be occultists, new agers who learn how to astral project, things like that, because what they're doing is with fifth dimensional phenomena, because it's subjectively verifiable, like you can't just like, how do I want to word it? I can tell someone how this stuff works, but that doesn't allow them to actually use that information for their advantage. They have to be the one to practice using, they have to understand the information, learn it first, and then practice putting it in, practice putting it into practice, I guess. You get what I'm trying to say. But they have to practice using that information to create certain outcomes. Now that is different from physical science because it's externally observable and it strongly interacts with matter. So for example, engineering. Like I can use a computer. I don't need to know anything about computer science, right? Or chemistry or physics or anything to use that computer and benefit from the laws of nature in that way, right? The law, basically physics. Metaphysics isn't like that. There's nothing I can do to help you follow the laws of the physical realm to create certain outcomes and benefit from them, right? In applied, what you might call applied metaphysics, right? So there's nothing I can do on your behalf so that you are able to take advantage of these laws in the spirit realm, right? You have to learn those laws and you have to practice applying them. That would be the equivalent of someone learning physics and then learning engineering and then building stuff themselves, right? I don't have to do that with physical things, but I have to do that with metaphysical things, right, to take advantage of them in a certain way. And so that's the main difference between metaphysical science and science, right, in natural science, right? So people who learned, who these spiritual phenomena interact with people's consciousness, right, and they've learned how to pay attention and kind of recognize when one thing is happening versus another thing, what the conditions were, and so they go through the same scientific method I'm talking about, and so they start to learn how to channel spirits, right? They learn how to engage in magic. They learn how to speak to demons. And so these would be the metaphysical engineers. This is a negative way I'm talking about. These would be metaphysical engineers who are using this form of scientific method to figure out how to use the physics of the spiritual realm or the rules of the spirit realm to engage in metaphysical engineering. No one else can do it for them, right? Now, atheists, like I said, because they're lazy, they don't like that. They hate that, right? They always want it to be the case that any truth has to be something that they can check with someone else, right? They don't want to be responsible for the truth themselves. They don't want to be responsible or have to, they don't want it to be the case that it has to be them and their own effort and them just being good enough to analyze the truth and figure it out within their own subjective experience. Someone can tell them, but they still have to do the work, right? They have to do it. No one can do it for them. That's how fifth dimensional phenomena is. They don't like that. They don't want to do the work. They want someone else to be able to do it. They want to have the privilege of, even if I don't do the work, I want someone else to do it, and I want everyone to be able to look at the work and agree on it. And so that way I know that it's not on me if I'm wrong, right? Or it's not on me to find the truth, right? I can always put it off to someone else, right? And so that's just a form of laziness, right? That's not how fifth dimensional phenomena is. The whole world can agree on something and it can still be wrong, and you have to be the one to find the truth within your own subjective experience, right? And because you're just good enough in some way. So we're actually going to talk a little more about that in the next video. But you have to be the one to do it. And that's how it is. A lot of witches, in New Agers and occultists were able to do it, and they did figure out. So they engaged in metaphysical engineering to cast spells and use the law of manifestation generally to create outcomes in this world that they want. So that would be metaphysical engineering. Now, the positive way of doing all this stuff is communicating with God. Because it's the same thing. God communicates with you through your own subjective experience. He gives you experiences. He helps you to create certain outcomes. We talked about this in chapter 10. The Holy Spirit will help you to manifest the will of God, right? Nothing done outside the will of God will ever be good. So to create the most perfect reality, you have to learn how to communicate with the Holy Spirit and speak to God and your angels. You have to learn how all that works. We talked about how dreams work. Dreams are metaphorical. You have to learn you have to figure out the metaphor in your dream. All of that metaphysical engineering has to be done by you. You have to do the work, right? You can't rely on anyone else or just say, someone will do it for me on my behalf. No, you can't do that. I can have someone build me a computer if I want to, if I want a computer. If I want to manifest the will of God and metaphysically engineer my reality, I have to do the work. Right now, sure, I can rely on someone else to carry out the will of our Father. But if I want to do it for me, on my behalf, I have to do it. No one can do it for me. They can do it for themselves and I can benefit from them, but I have to do it. So building a computer, I can easily have someone else build it, and then I benefit from it. They can build it on my behalf for me. So you can't do that in the spirit realm. And that's why I just want to say atheists generally hate that because they're lazy. They don't want to do that work, right? So every argument they have will always reduce in some form to requiring whatever truth there is or whatever phenomena there is. It has to be externally observable. It has to be. That's every claim they ever make is always, there's no evidence, which is just an opinion, right? Like I always say, you can have people who believe the earth, is round and flat earthers. They can look at the same evidence regarding earth, and one person will conclude this proves the earth is flat, another person will conclude this proves the earth is round. It's just an opinion, right? There's no real if there's no such thing as absolute evidence, right? You just look at a body of data or a body of facts and come to your conclusion about what's true and what isn't. An atheist, they will generally they'll never come to the conclusion that God exists because they're lazy and they want evidence to always come in a form that doesn't require them to verify it through their own subjective experience. Because when that's the case, the whole world can say something isn't existing and could be wrong, but you know because you verified it in your own subjective experience. So they'll just say, oh, well, no, that proves it isn't. That will generally mean it's not correct because it could just be your mind and you could be, just imagining things like that. No. We have a scientific method. We have a process for this. Now, again, I'm kind of I'm going to talk about it in the next video because I am going to talk about this in reference to God. But you get what I'm trying to say, right? But anyway, so I think that's pretty much it. So I went through everything I want to talk about. But this is the correct paradigm, epistemological framework of metaphysical science. You cannot apply the same rules of regular science to metaphysical science. They're different, right? When it comes to, I believe that society as a whole should adopt this framework when studying metaphysical things. So if we study the human body especially, whether it be miraculous healings, whether it be especially psychology and therapy, I think, as I already talked about it, I think they are massively incomplete and they do a detriment to society, right? And I'll probably make another video on this, which I kind of talked about the basics of this in chapter 10, but I'm just saying, right, a lot of people think because they're relying on this materialist explanation for their well-being and their health, society fails massively, right? Like so many people are depressed, unhappy. There is this battle between the sexes now, which created the red pill movement and toxic feminism, which is basically a supremacist movement now. Like people watch adult content online, think it's okay because there's no such thing as sin according to them, right? There's no such thing as demons. Like there's so many problems in society from the silly notion that the mind only comes from materials, right? So it's fundamentally incomplete to deal with the problems in our society, right? But if we apply the concept of metaphysical science, right, then we can actually help society properly, right? Because we can recognize what fifth dimensional phenomena are, where they interact. By the way, I also said that there may be other events in reality that have a strong interaction. Well, maybe not a strong interaction. It could be a strong interaction in space and things like that. With like dark energy, for example, could be another exception where there's a strong interaction with the spirit realm. But still, I talked about how I think AI has a weak interaction with fifth dimensional space because of the observer effect, which I'm going to talk a little more about that in the next video. But I did mention that in the Law of Knowing, where I talked about that in chapter 10. So that's another thing you couldn't fully explain without appealing to the fifth dimension. So I'm just saying that there's a difference between the two. I think society would be massively benefited by acknowledging this. Don't just try and explain everything by physical science, right? That's a claim about the nature of reality. Only atheists do that because they're lazy, right? Any actual scientist recognizes that any actual scientist takes reality as it is, not how they want it to be, right? That's how what atheists do that because they don't actually practice science. Real scientists take reality as it is. And how it appears to be is that there are metaphysical phenomena that weakly interact with the third dimension, physical space, and the exception where there's a strong interaction with physical space are for living things. So you have to study these things according to fifth dimensional principles and using this metaphysical scientific method. So that's it. I think I've rambled enough. So in the next video, I'm gonna kind of apply these same ideas to God. I'm going to talk about the epistemology of God and talk about epistemological framework of God. Again, I'll use a lot of the principles that came from chapter 10 because those were really the laws of metaphysics. But I just kind of want to set up a framework also for God. But yeah, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.